They don't really care if he has the lowest approval rating in his first 100 days since Dwight
But you
D.
got to
Eisenhower.
think, like, at this point, if you're a person who surrounded yourself with Trump, you've blown through January 6th. You've blown through him getting indicted. You've blown through a lot. He got,
and
assassination
you've blown through
attempt.
anybody who challenges your worldview. Because
sure.
if you look at those cabinet meetings, they're basically going around the
It's
table
true believers only.
saying how
Yeah.
great he is and how he's doing everything right. So he doesn't really have any pushback internally, for
That's
sure.
what I'm saying. I'm saying the people around him now are much more unified than the first term, where he was cobbling together a team of rivals based off of an election they did not think they were going to win. Now, that's much different than this time around. They have been planning about what they would do when they would come back to power.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Next Question. So if you want to know what Americans are really thinking, not just what the polls are saying or what coastal columnists are opining, you have to talk to voters face to face, travel to where they are, and find places where they are game to talk. That is exactly what Astead Herndon does. He is a national politics reporter for the New York Times who makes it his business to hear what voters are thinking. How are they feeling about Donald Trump? What are they thinking about the Democratic Party today? And all this made me wonder, how does Astead get so many people to open up to him? Astead Herndon, thank you for being here. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
I think of you as the official man on the street interviewer, journalist for the New York Times, because you spend so much of your time talking to real Americans.
Yeah.
And I'm curious just about the logistics of that. How do you manage your schedule? Where do you decide, how do you decide where to go and who you're going to be able to talk to? And are people willing to talk to you? So I just asked you 4 questions in one.
Well, I'll start with just kind of where that lens came from. Like for me, since so much of my kind of entrance into national political reporting was coming after the 2016 election, it felt as if there were things happening on the ground and kind of outside more than it was being dictated by parties and candidates. I actually remember when I was in D.C. working for the Boston Globe is when Charlottesville happened.
I was
and
there.
I remember thinking, I kind of want to be out there. And I think that that's my best use, is like some kind of change that's happening in this country. And frankly, I think in the experience of the 2016 election, feeling like not enough political journalism had taught me about my neighbor and my communities and these other kind of places and the diversity of the electorate. And so when I got the opportunity and coming to the Times to cover elections, I made it pretty clear that like that's where I thought my best use was in kind of telling stories from bottom up rather than top down.
Why do you think there's such a disconnect, Astead?
I think that, for a lot of people, there was a lot of assumptions about the ways that the country was changing that were coming from the parties, right? If we remember that Obama era, the idea that the country was having more immigrants, more black and brown people was supposed to kind of inevitably move it in this assumed direction. And I just think some of those assumptions really flattened the differences in those folks and flattened the ways they were changing the country. And so when I got the opportunity to go out there, it became really clear to me that, hey, some of this stuff that people are assuming about these people and about the way our politics would be sorted doesn't really seem true. And so that really was informing me at the time. And I really just get the most energy from it, too. I have a natural curiosity to those folks and really feel like bringing people into the process and bringing their voices into the process is really a value add. But to your question of like, how do you decide? I think that's a real big onus I put on myself is like, if our elections are going to be decided mostly by maybe people who don't trust the New York Times inherently or aren't following the news all the time, you can't just go to that traditional rally. You can't just go to the campaign event because they're not there. And so we try to think of more untraditional events where we can find people and bring politics to them. So I think of an example of the Iowa State Fair and a couple years ago where, the traditional thing to do is to follow the candidates, as we had done multiple times before. But instead of doing that this time around, we went to the Jason Aldean concert on the last day of the Iowa State Fair because he had that song, Try That in a Small Town, that was kind of going viral among Republicans. And we thought that asking people there what that song meant to them and what kind of rural identity meant to them was more fruitful than just saying, what do you think about this candidate? What do you think about this candidate?
That's so smart.
And so I'm saying we just try to think differently about where to go. And it really, I think, gives different results. And so I think of another example about we wanted to cover masculinity and young men in this election. So we went tailgating with frat boys in Madison and talked to them about why they identified with Donald Trump, as on a day in which Charlie Kirk was coming to campus, and a lot of them were going to that event. And so to your point, it really asks us different questions. I think brings different people into the political conversation. But I think you can always have a problem of just finding 2 or 3 individual voices. So I always want to make sure we're lining up with polling. We're lining up with the reporting that the rest of the Times is doing too. Because if we just have one person who seems like an outlier, that makes me a little nervous, And so I think the real power of the work is when you're giving the why behind a reason why someone's voting, and then polling's telling you, the aggregate numbers, or our folks like Maggie Haberman, Jonathan Swan telling you what's happening on the inside. I think all of those things add up to a better political picture, but we try to bring the voter and the electorate, bring them into it, because I kind of feel like, particularly in this moment, they've been the ones who have been most outside of that conversation.
Is it hard for you to get people to talk to you, to open up and be truthful with you? I mean, you are from the New York Times, that
Sure.
For a lot of people in the middle of the country, or even, all over the country, for a certain set of people, that's sort of the enemy of the people, if you will, so proclaimed by President Trump. But, you're a young black man, you're with the New York Times, and you're talking to frat boys at the University of Wisconsin about male anger.
I'm at a Trump rally in Tulsa.
I'm curious. So I'm one of those frat boys. How do you approach me?
Well, the first thing I try to do is tell you why I'm there and be really open and kind of vulnerable about the process, and tell you, the reason and framework that kind of brought us to it. And oftentimes, I think when you acknowledge people's concern, like I don't think I'm owed anyone's time. I don't think I'm owed anyone's voice or their beliefs. And I kind of acknowledge the ways in which I understand they would be skeptical by it too. And so if someone says, I feel like the New York Times doesn't represent voices like me or hasn't included those people, I don't really try to talk them out of it. I really just say, what am I here for otherwise? But I'm here because I want to bring your perspective to the forefront. So I think going is really the thing that gives me the best opportunity, because you've already proven you care about bringing them in if you're there, right? And then the other thing I think about is I don't feel the need to talk people out of their media distrust. I sometimes empathize with their media distrust, and it really wasn't kind of Trump voters or conservatives that taught me that. Back when I was a local crime reporter for the Boston Globe, and I was going to Roxbury and Dorchester and those communities, they would look at a Globe reporter, even though I was black or whatever, and say, your paper only shows up here when there's a murder. You're not here consistently and all through that time. And so I actually really empathize with that viewpoint. But I would also argue, I remember then saying, you're going to want an empathetic record of what happened today. You're going to want facts and accuracy about what is going on. And you were going into the worst day of people's lives all the time. And so that was really my training in terms of learning how to try to create trust. But I really think it's not like a science more so than it is. I try to be honest. I try to be understanding. And I
try to listen.
And I just link, and I think audio helps too, because I don't have to tell them I'm just picking a quote here or there, right? They get to be a more full person, and they hear that personhood reflected. And so we've had pretty good returns with Republicans, honestly, partially because I think they feel more confident that they will be heard in full. Mm-hmm. And so we almost to a person get responses saying, I did not expect this, but I really feel represented in what I heard. And that's to me the best part. I'm not there, particularly with voters, to force accountability or to indict their beliefs. I really am there to get to clarity. And so once they're clear and kind of honest, that's good for me. It's not like a politician interview or one of those where you try to need accountability or you're fact checking or things like that. I'm trying to get I'm with individual people. I'm just trying to get them to be most honest and most open.
So what has been the most surprising thing for you, Astead, being on the ground in terms of your preconceived notions of how Americans are feeling, or even specifically Trump voters, and what you have found when you actually go and speak to them face to face?
I would say, I guess, we talk a lot about polarization in our country and the split between DNR and the ways in which our electorate has been divided. And I think my interpersonal experiences are more kind than people would expect across the board. It actually makes me think that the polarization, it might be more driven by system, might be more driven by the fact that they have to sort themselves into parties, or gerrymandering has changed Congress to mean that they don't have to look at
algorithms.
Yeah, I'm like algorithms on the internet. I'm like, it makes me think more about the ways divisions imposed on us, because when I have those interpersonal interactions, when I'm actually there, I very rarely have the type of contentious moments. They've happened every now and then, but I have them a lot less than people expect. And so that's one thing that really comes to mind almost immediately. But the other one's kind of corny, but like I've gotten to go everywhere. I'm sure you've had this experience too, where like I've gotten to travel so many places in the country too. And I just think I've had a better appreciation of the diversity, the beauty, like things there are places like, think about the Deep South and my kind of Chicago upbringing. Like I thought of it as kind of like, slavery land, to be honest, or like past and all of this stuff. And I think that my experiences there were so different than that perception that you can't really shake. It makes really clear how that was your own biases. And so I've had that a number of times in a lot of places. And I feel like it really just makes me feel like with intention and with thought, you can find connection wherever. And I know that's not like fully a political answer, but I do think it reminds me about the polarization question we face and how much of that is like a electorate that's divided and how much of that is a political system that's dividing an electorate.
That's so interesting because I think, I get fed a lot of algorithms that reinforce sort of my own point of view.
Yeah.
And I often wonder, like, how can people so blindingly support Donald Trump at this moment in time?
Yeah.
And we'll talk about sort of where we are as a country in general, but do you go in like, how could you in any way, or you never have that frame of reference? It's always, why do you?
Yeah, it's way more why do you. I mean, I go back to the Boston and local experience too, because I remember when I would do those stories, you would have to emotionally center yourself kind of before you went in to that tough situation. And I kind of still do that outside of the rally or outside of the event. And I think whatever happens over the next couple hours is not about me, And I'm really just trying to draw folks out. And I'm really just trying to follow my own curiosity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that, I remember the complaints about the diner stories,
Right.
Trump in the first term, where people were so sick of going back to people and say, oh, do you still support him? They would say, yeah, I still support him. They're like, why are we doing this? And I guess to me, those are just poorly executed. You're not asking the right questions, right? And I don't want to let people get away with the same things that we hear all the time. So because of that self-selecting media you're talking about, we hear the same phrases over and over. Oh, he's a businessman. Oh, he says what other people are thinking. And so me and the folks I work with, we're always pushing past that. We're trying to say, what is it that he's saying that others won't say? Like, what is the actual issue? What is the moment that brought you to him if you were skeptical before? Like, let's get actual pieces of themselves that highlight that, rather than the kind of, I think, more neutral phrases that folks are used to getting to. And I think when you break past that barrier, there is actual interesting stuff that I can trust myself to just follow. And so if I'm bored, I trust that everyone else is going to be bored too, right? And
right.
so I am I'm in that conversation thinking, well, what parts of this do I find interesting and how do we get deeper there? But, some of the experiences are wild. Like I was...
What's your wildest experience?
And if we're talking Trump and Trump voters, I was, in 2019, I really wanted to... Well, actually, I'll say a different one. In 2020, right after the election, when Biden was finally announced the winner, I was in Wisconsin. And I remember telling to my editor, because of these experiences I had, I've been talking to all these Trump voters along the way, going specifically to like MAGA places. In 2016, when Trump won, I joined all these Trump Facebook groups and prioritized them on my news feed so I would live in kind of Trumpness. And so I went and so I was telling him, I'm pretty sure a group of these people will not recognize Joe Biden as legitimate, that there's no way that they would actually see him as a legitimate president. And so he was like, okay, follow up with some of them. And so I go down to Texas, and I'm with this family. I spend this day with this family. I go to their church. And I went to this county specifically because it had the biggest swing towards Trump in the country. And so I go to this church. I have to spend this whole day with this church. And then at the end of the day, we start talking about BLM. And, at this point, they've been really kind to me. They brought me into their home. They made some food. They gave me some lemonade, all this stuff. But at this point, they also start talking about if these people come to their town, they're going to string them up. One of them said the N-word. And all of this stuff is happening. At the same time, the kindness existed 20 minutes before and existed 20 minutes after. And so what I remember about the print version of that story is you can't fully feel all of those things change, right? I included in the string 'em up quote, and that gets all this buzz and attention. And I remember kind of feeling bad for them because we had this whole day that really just got swallowed up in a very dramatic and bigoted thing that happened at the end. But that's why I liked audio, is because I thought I don't have to choose. You can actually hear that whole interaction and you recognize the nuance and complexity much more without me picking and choosing. And so I don't want to act like I actually felt bad, but I felt like it did not fully represent my own experience there. And I wanted to be in a place that can more do that three-dimensional storytelling.
That's so interesting.
There's a couple others too. There's moments I trust people when they tell me we don't want you here. I'm sure, and I leave. I'm not fully unhinged, but in most ways, I often think if you phrase it in the right way and if you present yourself in the right way, I've mostly had people come to you.
I'm thinking about a statistic I read recently that 56% of Republicans view January 6th as legitimate political discourse. Now, in the hands of Astead Herndon, how do you talk to a Trump voter about that?
Well, one, if you are showing up to a Trump voter and you don't live in conservative news, you're already way behind. So already in those interactions, they can tell if you actually read or listen or watch or the world that they're in. And so
do you have to immerse yourself in conservative media?
Yeah, that's why I say the thing about joining Trump Facebook groups, watching Fox News, following, kind of MAGA influencers. You have to actually know, because there's a separate set of there's a separate stories that go viral. There's a separate news cycle. They have a different language. And so if you're in that in-person interaction and you're talking about things and they seem and you seem like this is the first time you're hearing about it, they know already that you're already at a distance. And so I would say the first thing I would do is follow what they follow, to form those connections. And so the story I'll tell about this is I remember in the period after the 2020 election, but before January 6th. So right after I did that Texas story, I was assigned to go do the Georgia runoff. So I was in Georgia the whole time. And I remember, again, me, someone who has done that work, has followed, knows, I remember thinking, this is more feral than usual. This isn't the usual conspiracy crowd. I'm at an Ivanka Trump event in the Georgia suburbs, and these moms are talking to me about Dominion voting machines. Something different's happening here. And so because I live in it, you can tell the moments that are outside of it too. And I think it had me prepared for something like this. I mean, not prepared as in, I think those scenes were shocking to everybody. But the possibility of violence, the possibility of illegitimacy of results, the possibility that they did not see the term democracy. They thought democracy was under threat too, just in a completely different way. I knew all that stuff. And so that's where following really helps. The other thing I do is I'm not shocked. There's usually a moment when they push you and are expecting you to react and are pressing a button almost intentionally. And I've always found, look at the sky, act like nothing's happened. And it really helps you get over it. Example I would say about this, I was in Northern Arizona and I was at what was called Trump Stock, which was this Trump fans Woodstock, which had a whole bunch of people there who were
I never heard of Trump
Yeah,
Stock.
because that would mean you're living a really fringe space. This wasn't even the normal influencers. These are the folks that can't even get on Fox News. And I was doing the story about really about conspiracy. And what I do when I get there is I don't want to be secret. So I wear my badge openly. I go to the organizer first. I try to win them over and tell them, here's what I'm here to do. And I remember when I got there, the organizer says, okay, let's talk, and comes and sits down. And the first thing they did is put his gun on the table, right? And so I just keep pushing. I just keep going. And so my experience, that's a dramatic version of that, but people do that verbally and kind of rhetorically all the time. Or they'll mention your own blackness, or they'll mention something else. And I'm saying blow through it. And so those are my strategies. And there's little ones too, like crowds are bad. So if you're at a rally, find them one-on-one when they're going to get a concession or when you can talk to them directly. If you talk to them in a line and a whole bunch of people start watching, you're going to be a spectacle. And so like there's little things you learn too, but really I just think like I care. Like sometimes when people ask me, how does this work? I'm like, well, if you don't care, well, it won't work, you know? And so I have a lot of identities, you know? I'm also from the Midwest. I grew up in a fairly religious family. Like some of the stuff they say at those things feels familiar, you know? I tell people that a Trump rally often feels SEC football game or mega church just as much as it does political rally. And those things aren't shocking to me. Those are things I have been to, and you know? And so I guess I would just say in aggregate, like I try not to make it feel as othering as they expect you to make them.
Right.
Feel, right. They expect the black person at the New York Times to be treating them like a kind of experiment.
Right.
And so if you are the opposite of that, I think it helps the interaction.
So in aggregate, what have you learned about Trump voters? And I want to talk to you then about how things have changed, if they have
so I was
changed.
like, it has changed. That definition's really
okay,
changed.
well then let's talk about that. I know that you took a break after the election just to kind of, I don't know, get
my life back.
yeah, exactly, and sort of stabilize everything. And you jump back into the fray, sort of around the time that Trump announced so-called Liberation Day, which you see as a real threshold moment of his second term.
Yeah.
So tell me what propelled you to hit the road again and at that moment in time.
Well, you need moments that cut through. And so sometimes things are major or big policy, but they haven't necessarily gotten to the type of news uninterested voter that I'm sometimes talking about here, or someone who's not following it day to day. And I think that's particularly true in a year like this, where there's not a decision on their hands, right? There's not some imminent choice for these folks. But tariffs, and specifically because we heard so much about inflation going in, we heard so much about
the price of eggs.
Over the last couple of years. I thought, and I thought this is one of the things. And I remember even last year asking folks about the possibility of tariffs, and they would just assume he wouldn't do it. You know, there was a lot of projection, or I think nostalgia about first term that was informing folks' vote, and it was much less about the solutions he was saying. And so even when we would ask people, hey, on that stage, he said he's gonna, do this. He said he's gonna do these tariffs. Like people just kind of, well, he didn't do that last time, or things turned out fine then. And so now that we had that kind of moment, it felt to me like, oh, I can go back to literally these same people and reference the conversations that we had now that it's become a bigger reality. And what we found really matched up with, what the Times number said and other things, which is that there's certainly a causal relationship the White House has created with this chaos, with these tariffs, and people feeling like he's not focusing on bringing prices down, and obviously could bring it the other way. And that is I saw Trump say the other day, the good parts of the economy are mine, the bad parts are Joe Biden's. Nobody believes that, right? Like it was very clear, even to those voters, even the people who voted for him, that whatever happens next, and in the White House's version, that's a return of jobs, and every economist's version, that's not, and that's the possibility of raised prices or even a recession. But whatever happens next is his fault, because he has created that type of relationship, and the voters were expressing that. They were expressing fear of what's happening next because of the tariffs. And I think the way they were administered also reminded folks of the same problems of Trump administration number one, was just bad governance, which lack of expertise, lack of increased chaos in general. And so I think it was not only the reality, but also how it was done really seemed, and even in going back to our people, really seemed to rub them the wrong way. Now, that's different than saying, I regret my vote, right? Because we talked to, I think, about 20-ish people who we had talked to before. A bunch of those folks expressed disappointment about tariffs, and about the presence of Elon Musk were the things that came up the most. Mm-hmm. Like the co-presidency of it all was kind of surprising to folks. But very few of them said that meant they wished Kamala Harris was president. And so that's a very distinct answer, right? We see this in recent favorability numbers too. Like, Donald Trump has had a decreased approval rating, but the Democrats is worse.
Right.
And so that was really reflected in those type of undecideds we were going back to. They were disappointed in Donald Trump. And I think that could have a big effect in things like midterms and the like going forward. But that's much different than saying they regretted voting for Donald Trump.
For now,
because
it sounds...
Because they did not at this point.
For now, it seems as if they're giving him some grace. You know, some people you talk to give him credit for trying, right?
Yeah.
And so there seems to be this level of forgiveness for Donald Trump that might not be applicable to anyone else.
Anyone else, any other Republican even. We've seen Republicans try to do the same thing and it not really work out.
How do you explain that?
Some of that is a literal brand. I mean, I will say this. We were at a plant in Michigan talking to auto workers who were affected by tariffs directly. Stellantis had closed jobs a couple weeks earlier, citing tariffs. And we were asking some of those people about, okay, is this Donald Trump's fault? And you would hear over and over, he's negotiating, art of the deal. Like, you would hear some leeway, even if they were kind of unnerved. And I remember the White House press secretary saying a couple days later, like, oh, it's just art of the deal. And a lot of journalists were like laughing and like kind of mocking it. And it is ridiculous, but it's true. Like, he has a brand that is different than anybody else, specifically on this issue.
That inoculates him from criticism.
That inoculates him from some criticism or creates a runway or an expectation of chaos that's built into him that's different than other politicians. And so I would definitely say that part of that comes through. But I would also say the thing that came up at that plant was he had named a real problem that Democrats had not named. They were saying that it is true that, you know, their jobs have gone overseas. It is true that they feel like globalization has kind of left them behind. And so the reason you have the Michigan governor, you know, saying tariffs are a tool, or other people not fully rejecting them outright, is because particularly in states that Democrats have lost in, let's say Michigan or Ohio's or Wisconsin's of the world, those are thought of as helpful for American jobs because they feel as if in the last 20 years, no one's really been talking about it, and that the parties had a kind of shared agreement before Donald Trump came around, that this type of globalization that their jobs are just a casualty in terms of the larger efforts of globalization. And so all I would say is, like, that was true even from the Democrats we talked to at the plant. People didn't vote for Donald Trump at all. Say, oh yeah, but he totally is talking about a real thing that I wish even our party talked about more. And so I think those are the two things that give him
cover for now.
Yeah, cover for now are the brand and then the fact that he is naming a problem that some folks agree with. But I would just kind of caution the cover because I don't think that insulates him from a real raise in prices, right? Or some tangible inflation that comes because of the tariffs. And I don't think that insulates Republicans from, you know, what could be a bad midterms in a year or so. But I just think it's not as black and white as sometimes it's presented as. And the reason the White House has some level of confidence here, and the reason why, you know, UAW president is saying, you know, it's not all against tariffs, is because even among the Democrats there, the non-Trump voter there is a recognition that Donald Trump has named a problem they wish the party named.
Right. Well, there's a difference, though, between naming a problem and executing a solution.
For sure.
And I think there are many people who felt, yes, illegal immigration was a problem in this country, but we may not want mass deportation without due process.
And it's the biggest difference between elections and governing, is people will vote on the problem, but then that can be completely distinct from what they say the solution is and what you're going to realize in the next year, right? And so I think so many voters we were talking to were not thinking about solutions. They were thinking about Donald Trump. They were thinking about their distaste for the status quo in the Biden administration, and that Donald Trump had kind of named that stuff. But I don't think it was ever a full endorsement of the MAGA agenda, of Project 2025, of the solutions he was presenting on economy, immigration, and things like that.
Well, I'm curious, did you hear that from voters, or are you hearing that, Astead? Like, yes, this was a problem, but boy, we don't really think this is the best way to approach it.
Sure.
Whether it's the deportation, as I mentioned, without due process, or whether it's Elon Musk wielding a chainsaw at CPAC and saying RIP to, USAID or whatever it was, whether it's doing these tariffs and they're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. Well, that's what I said, Doge with Elon Musk.
Yeah,
that's what I was referring to.
That's totally, we heard that on those issues really clearly was, there's a part of leeway we talked about, but they did not see tariffs as a solution. They did not see Elon Musk kind of running, getting Social Security passwords and giving it to his teenage minions as a solution, right? Or I think the due process and specifically how defiance of courts, specifically on immigration, that, all of that stuff came up. And so
does it bother voters?
I think I guess that's why I go back to folks not having a decision on their hands. It was expressed as not ideal, but only people who live in the day-to-day of politics think about that as regret. You get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It's like you turn on the news. It's like a show you watch, but you don't like an individual episode. I feel like for some of these people, I think they're still going to keep watching the show. And they just they just don't like kind of what's happening right now. They're still waiting for other shoes to drop. And so I don't think, I get what I'm saying. People have, there was disappointment that was expressed, but it's not as if there was a channel for where to put it. And so they weren't dealing with it, really. They're it seems unideal. Or it seems chaotic, and moving on with their day. Yeah.
So when do you think, or do you think that these independent voters and even sort of people who didn't like the alternative and didn't want to support Kamala Harris, do you think there will be a turning point? For example, we haven't really felt the full impact of these tariffs yet. And I think in the next couple of months,
for sure,
it's going to start, trickling down to the consumer. And do you think then that the runway that you described will continue for Donald Trump, or will it come to a screeching halt?
No, I think you're identifying the key point. The tangible impact of inflation is what matters here, at least in what these folks expressed. They were not saying that they're willing to not be able to feed folks in the name of Donald Trump, right? And I think that's what turns it from just something that's happening there to something that's affecting people's day-to-day life. And so if we see that tangible impact of inflation, I think we'll see folks. And I think the Biden administration is actually a helpful corollary to this, because it colors everything once that kind of pocketbook issue they lose faith on. So I think when the Biden administration was telling people that inflation was not that bad in 2021, rather than acknowledging people's concerns about it, that impacted the way they viewed immigration. That impacted the way they viewed Ukrainian aid. That it impacts everything else once they feel like you're not responding to the direct issue. It is I think the White House is careening towards a similar problem. I would say the difference, though, is this White House cares a lot less about public sentiment. It's much more at least, my sense of talking to them going into election and my sense of the reporting from folks I know who talk to them more on Inside Now. I mean, this is a project somewhat about insulating yourself from day-to-day public reaction, the expansion of executive authority, the reshaping of government. It's kind of an effort to not have to calibrate yourself to that median voter. And so I remember asking, a person who's not in the White House but is close to the White House, a couple months ago, aren't you all kind of, this stuff doesn't seem that popular, and their answer was, what happens? There's only 13 competitive House seats. They're pretty well set in the Senate, and actually really, I thought was really insightful, because the parameters, and this is why I go back to the political system, the parameters of blowback for them are kind of small, and they know that this time. And so I think of this effort, the second term versus first term, they were reactive to public sentiment a lot more in first term. This feels to me much more like an intentional expansion of executive authority, like an intentional pressure points of the legal system and the economic system through tariffs. I feel like it's a much more 360 worldview of retribution, and that matters more. That kind of power projection matters more than making sure they're doing the right things to keep them in a good place for the midterms. I don't think that's how they're thinking at all. And so I'm like, they are doing things that make their electoral lives harder. I just don't think they care. Is that a guy say that? I just don't think they care.
I mean, it sounds to me like they just want maximum transformation while
Yes,
they can do it,
while they can do it.
even if it does maximum damage to democratic institutions.
Yeah, they don't believe in those institutions. And so the point of this administration, in my opinion, is to wage war against them, And so when people talk about, what's happening with the Ivy Leagues or these law firms, I'm like, that was their plan, right? And so, the thing that was always true about the Project 2025 discussion last year was like, he never had to say endorse or not endorse, because the group of people around him believe fundamentally in those principles. And so I guess I just think now the limits will be tested almost inevitably, because it seems to me like that was the plan, And so,
but it's through the system, not through public opinion.
Right, exactly. And so when I care a lot about public opinion, and I care a lot about, hearing those folks, but I also feel like it's important to tell them the mandate that politicians and administrations take from elections is totally disconnected from the actual reasons you might have voted for them. Like, they only vaguely care why, And so I think so much of what's happening now is a White House that is not really, they're looking at the mandate in the macro. That, hey, we won the popular vote and we won all the swing states. It does not matter if that was small or for what reason or whatever. They have a project in mind. And I think
a grand scheme.
Yeah, they have an ideological project in mind, a fundamental belief that government and culture need to be brought back from what they would say is the liberal abyss. And that's what they're here to do. And I believe them.
And they don't really care if he has the lowest approval rating in his first 100 days since Dwight
But you
D.
gotta
Eisenhower.
think, at this point, if you're a person who surrounded yourself with Trump, you've blown through January 6th. You've blown through him getting indicted. You've blown through a lot. He got,
and
assassination
you've blown through
attempt.
anybody who challenges your worldview. Because
sure.
if you look at those cabinet meetings, they're basically going around the
It's true
table
believers only.
saying how
Yeah.
great he is and how he's doing everything right. So he doesn't really have any pushback internally, for
That's
sure.
what I'm saying. I'm saying the people around him now are much more, and I know this even from our reporters who deal with them day to day, are much more unified than the first term, where he was cobbling together a team of rivals based off of an election they did not think they were going to win. Now, that's much different than this time around. They have been planning about what they would do when they would come back to power. And so, that was kind of what we saw on the journey, was like, they are much more organized, and they have a clarified view. I would define as, retribution as a theme. But Trump, I'm like, this came up when Gates' nomination failed. I remember saying to someone, I was like, I think so much of political media is used to dealing in personality. So, Gates falls, so who's coming next, and And I'm like, I think there's an important thing to communicate. In this term, I'm pretty sure Donald Trump knows what he wants to do with that Department of Justice, and whoever's doing it is just a executioner,
Right.
And so whether it's Gates or Pam Bondi or whoever comes next, if you might get mad at Pam Bondi, they will be doing that, because unlike last time, he has a view of how he wants to reshape things.
Does that view scare you?
I don't know. I mean, I don't really think like that. That's a kind of I don't really think like that. I think
You're
that,
staying in the micro.
Not just that. I really think that we get what we deserve. Do we believe in this or not? I don't know. And so I think that now if I get really kind of esoteric about it, I think multiracial democracies are not stress tested thing, really. I think that we tell ourselves we've had this 200-year democracy, and even in my understanding of democracy, that only started including folks like me for all of that stuff so fairly recently. And so...
And most don't last more than 200 years.
And so I'm saying, I actually think we tell ourselves that our commitment to these values are entrenched, and they're actually to be determined. And so I guess I don't even know, this has always bothered me about the way they talked about democracy, they being Democrats last year, protect democracy, all these. And I was like, part of the reason I think they lost is that trust had already been eroded. And they weren't talking about improving. They weren't talking about, meeting folks where they are. They weren't talking about the ways democracy had failed people, know? They were just saying things are going fine, and Donald Trump broke it. And so I think now, what I believe about this White House is they're going to test it. Like, whether we as country and we as institutions and we as systems are, have pushback space against that, I don't know.
You talk about Democrats, and they have reached their own all-time low in the polling with an abysmal 27% approval rating. And it's interesting. You have framed the Democrats' broader challenge, and you spoke about this a second ago, as the choice between being, quote, protectors of institutions and improvers of them.
Yeah.
So can you unpack that for us and why you think this choice is so critical for Democrats right now?
Yeah.
And why they're failing so much.
Yeah, one thing I would want to say, is I think Democrats have a harder electorate challenge on their hands. The Republican base is much more monolithic, right? And Democrats, I think as they're coming to learn, diversity is a strength and it's also a challenge. Like, they have a lot of different types of people who don't all agree on the same vision of much of anything, And so I think they have to acknowledge that as a first thing. And some of the magic wands they were trying to wave around white supremacy or kind of like, or, I think they just thought that there were things that could hold things together, and we would have all the people who dislike the racists on this side, and you'll frame the other side as racist, and then they'll win. And I'm like, it's not really like that, And so I think that they have to believe they even need a vision. I don't even know. When's the last time I was really close to that 2019-2020 primary. I remember when kind of Warren was leading that race of ideas early. But that primary really collapsed because electability took over everything. It became much more about beating Donald Trump than it was about sorting through what they believed on immigration, what they thought healthcare systems should look like. All those conversations kind of collapsed. They've never really reopened them, And so basically what I think is going to happen, less so in the midterms because it's kind of too fragmented, but definitely in the next primary, is they are going to have to reopen those things. And I just think that that there's a part of the reason that they're at a 27%, part of the reason when we're going back to these voters and they're disliking Trump and they're still not preferring Democrats is because they do not have a sense of the competing vision, right? They know what Donald Trump largely believes on immigration. Nobody largely believes on certain issues. And at this point, when we ask them what do they believe Democrats, they talk about abortion rights, and they talk about trans women in sports, which is really, I don't even think it's something they're committed to. It's something that Republicans have put on them, know? And so that to me is just a sign that they're an empty vessel more than they filled up their own cup, And so I guess I think that's the distinction I'm really talking about, is a kind of internal decision among the party about what do we believe in. And you see people talking about this. I saw Chuck Schumer say the Democrats are united and that's what's important. And Bernie saying, well, what are we united around? That's what the missing piece is. And I think that's coming from, I don't even think that just in the ideological left, right, center. I think there's other issues that voters talk about to us all the time that they don't really deal with. Homelessness, education, term limits. That's one that Washington doesn't deal with, but we hear about it all the time.
From everyone.
Yes, all across the road. Money in politics, and so I think Bernie's actually a good example because, in his races, we focus so much on the kind of progressive, lefty, DSA style. When you would meet so many of voters who were there really because it just represented break from establishment, it just represented less money in politics, and a kind of outsider in the same way that Donald Trump is.
Well, I was going to say there was so much overlap between Bernie supporters and Trump supporters.
Right, because of that kind of outside of establishment thing. And so I just think that some of the questions they have to ask themselves going forward is how do they create a closer relationship and a closer conversation with their base? And how do they acknowledge that their base is diverse and that conversation might be a little uncomfortable, right? we in polling would see all the time that the softest places of support for supporting Ukraine among Democrats were among blacks and Latinos, among working class folks. So I'm saying there are places in the party where the universalness in DC is not really reflected on the ground. And those are the places where Republicans have picked folks off. And so they don't have a problem really among, news college educated. They've been doing better and better. They don't have really a problem in like politics interested. In smaller turnout elections, they've been destroying Republicans in a way that they were never doing under the Obama era. What they have struggled with, and Donald Trump specifically exploits, for the record. So Republicans can get a nominee and then this collapses. But Donald Trump specifically exploits is reaching someone who does not follow the news and exposing, I think, just their struggles with authenticity. And so they've been kind of consulted, in my opinion, out of being themselves often. And
What do you mean? Oh, you mean
I'll tell an example about this. Like,
consulted out of what?
I'm saying consulted out of being themselves. Mm-hmm. So an example about this.
Oh, you're talking about candidates.
Yeah, candidates. And so I'm saying Trump is a lot of things, but he's himself. And so that kind of non-traditional politician reaches different types of people, can go to different internet spaces, that aren't, when people talk about Kamala Harris on Call Her Daddy, the problem is not just where you're going. It's that when you go there, you sound exactly the same that you sound everywhere else.
Right.
And so I'm like, that is just a message thing. Like, that is just like but I think Trump specifically exploits that.
But do you think it ever gets so extreme that it goes from authenticity to bizarre or disrespectful? I'm thinking about Trump posting himself in papal garb, for example.
Trump is disrespectful. I think Trump is.
Or saying people can get, I don't think a beautiful baby girl that's 11 years old needs to have 30 dolls. I think they can have 3 dolls or 4 dolls.
But one thing I want to say about this, though, I think sometimes we act as if those things have not hurt Trump. Trump is an unpopular politician. And when we are out there in the world, people cite these things all the time as problems they have with Donald Trump. And even in the last several years.
But they forgive him.
In the last several years, I don't think a vote for him is always a forgiveness, right? I think that's why I go back to the system. The last couple years, they were wrestling with the fact that they didn't like either of their options. We would not just hear, we were hearing both sides as bad, right? Like, and so people were working through and expressing their dislike of Donald Trump, but they were also wrestling with their dislike of the status quo and blaming the Democratic Party for that. And so I don't think we should say those things are forgotten or forgiven, more so than they were
tolerated.
Yeah, they were deprioritized on their list and other things were prioritized. And so when there's not an election, those things stick out more. That's why his approval rating's going down. That's why, that's why they might have a tough midterm. So I don't think they don't matter. You know what I'm saying? I do think they didn't cost him the election, and they didn't matter more than anything else. And the Democratic premise, I remember in 2023, they were fine with it being a referendum on Donald Trump because they thought they win that. They thought those things hurt him and that he would invalidate himself. And I'm like, that was the bad assumption.
Right. Well, if grabbing by the didn't hurt him.
I think we should have some examples to tell us those were bad assumptions. Like, that's why I was thinking, like, are you sure about that? Because we have a lot of things that have already happened. If January 6th can't cost you a Republican nomination, like, that's something else, happening. And so I was on the same page, but I'm saying, but sometimes I think people go a little too far and act like he's Teflon Don and nothing sticks to him. I'm like, actually, that's not my experience with voters either. These things are things they don't like and wish he did not do, in large part. Like, there's a certain set of people who will love whatever he does. But there are Republicans, there are undecided. All of those people, we hear about those things all the time.
So where are you headed next?
I don't know. I think we have to kind of let things dictate what happens. I think that we see some of these pressure points, particularly with courts and legal system rising. I think we know that the White House wants to focus on increasing deportations. So I think that's going to be a big focus of ours, is trying to see kind of public reaction to that. Do we see the type of scenes we saw in the first term where, a Muslim ban and moments cause people to really come out and push back? That's kind of where I'm interested in. But I don't know where that leads me just yet. But we're figuring it out.
Well, I'm really glad you're doing this. Do you think other sort of traditional and legacy media organizations are catching on to the need to have more people on the ground? Because I think people pulled back for financial
Yeah,
reasons
it's hard.
and closed bureaus
Yep.
and all that. And I really think your reporting is so essential because I think the less that it's done, the bigger the divide.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I really think, the Times I know has, from us and others, has reinvested in the kind of idea that that's what makes us unique, right? Like, I think there's so much content, right? There's so much analysis even or punditry. But going there and getting that type of original reporting, I really think is what makes newspapers stand out. And so even though folks are investing in it less and may want to pay for it less, they still
And local newsrooms are closing.
yeah, and like the ecosystem has changed. You can still feel how vital it is, and how much it feeds the broader media ecosystem. Like I'm like, someone's got to go. Someone's got to ask them. They don't matter. I want to pay for you to go, right? Like and so all those content creators are making stuff off of somebody going.
Oh, I know.
And so I feel like it's an opportunity for newspapers, but I really think we should also take some other lessons. It's like I think the era that we ask people to trust us just because is over. So I don't think the reason to trust us is because it's a New York Times. I think we have a process. We show that process. You can hear that process. And I think something that media can take is that type of vulnerability is
and
helpful.
transparency.
And transparent. That is helpful for actually gaining those things. Because I think, I tell the people when they ask me about like the Times and things like that, I'm like, the process of editing is actually, I think, would inspire more trust. Like the difference between us or a random place is that we are used to going through a fact-checking and context process that helps a story. And so I think we should open some of that up. And I feel like that's the work we've been trying to do and like others, because I think there's nothing to hide, honestly. And that when we put it out there, folks are more likely to come to us, not less.
One person asked on social, how do you keep your morale as a journalist when the president and the public, left and right, keep bashing the media?
Yeah.
And you say nobody owes you their trust and you have to work to gain it. On the other hand, when they're, loaded for bear, right? When it comes to the media, it is hard. And
it's different too. I've even seen it in my time, like that type of media antagonism rise. And it comes up on the road for sure. I guess what I think, like my morale though, is not based in, and I think this is a change that happened for me. Like I had to remove myself from only caring about impact or caring about, a politician or public acting on it or really, I really started caring more about the record itself and being like, actually, there's real power in just bringing these voices here and trusting that in the end, there's going to be some value to the fact that like whether folks listened or not, there was a record built that showed a more diverse set of viewpoints.
Even if you don't necessarily understand.
Even if you don't understand, even if you don't agree, like bringing those folks to the table has value within itself. And so really I channel that through the work, and that helps my morale, is that like it's kind of distinct from what folks do with it. It's distinct from how folks vote because of it. I love the process of bringing people in. And the other thing I try to do is like, election-wise, it doesn't help to be a super wonk. You have to have interests because people have other interests, and it's also informing their vote. So I try to make sure I think about things that are not politics and journalism. And I think it's actually
for your own sanity.
It's an intentional effort to be like,
I'm going to go ride a bike today.
Yeah, I'm like, I have to be in places of culture and like have a life that is helpfully rounded, because it actually makes my connection to folks better. Like watching Real Housewives makes my journalism better, because I can be somewhere, someone can reference something and I understand it, right? Like sports makes my journalism better because I know kind of what's informing people in communities. And so I'm saying I try to make sure I think about other stuff, because one, I would just be too overwhelming. But two, like it actually comes up a lot. I'll tell a story about this. I said this yesterday, but I remember when I was in Boston and I had to do all those cop interactions because I was covering crime and stuff. And I was having such a tough time, like, just like connecting with them and also just like, not giving me information. It was just kind of taxing. And, I remember talking to some editor about it, and I was like, all they do is sit around and talk about baseball. And they were like, well, have you considered watching some baseball? And it actually was so helpful. On the ride over, I would listen to WEI. I would like hear all the baseball like talk. And then I would get there, and in the first 10 minutes, we would just talk about baseball, and the whole day would be better. And so it actually made me remember, like, just treating him as police officer is making this worse, too. And so I try to think about that in terms of voters and all this other stuff. It's like
thinking of them people first.
Yeah, and I'm like, and if you want to talk to me about something that's not politics before we talk about something else, sure. Like, but like that requires me not being someone. I think we all know people in news who are 24/7 news, and sometimes it requires that. Like, and I definitely follow the news all the time. I guess I'm just saying I had to be like, that cannot be your whole life. And actually, if you're going to be out there, it's actually better for it not to be your whole life.
I really needed to hear this today.
No. This is me encouraging interest all around. It's me talking to myself. Like, have your hobbies.
Well, thank you so much for coming in, and thank you for bringing so much energy at the end of what I'm sure was a long day for both of us. It's great to see you, Astead. And again, thank you for your terrific reporting and also just your overall intelligence and humanity.
Thank you for having me. I mean, it's like an honor. Like, you're a legend in the streets. So I say it not even like casually, like anytime, any place, I'll be there.
Thank you, Astead.
Tell
your mom I said hi.
Oh my goodness, she's gonna love that.